The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, also known as the Amritsar Massacre, was an event which took place on 13 April 1919 when a crowd of non-violent protesters, along with Baishakhi pilgrims, who had gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar, Punjab, were fired upon by troops of the British Indian Army under the command of Colonel Reginald Dyer. The civilians had assembled to participate in the annual Baisakhi celebrations, both a religious and cultural festival for the Punjabis. Coming from outside the city, they may have been unaware of the martial law that had been imposed. The Bagh space comprised 6 to 7 acres and was walled on all sides except for 5 entrances. On Dyer's orders, his troops fired on the crowd for 10 minutes. Directing their bullets largely towards the few open gates through which people were trying to run out. The figures released by the British government were 379 dead and 1,200 wounded. Other sources place the number of dead at well over 1,000. This brutality stunned the entire nation, resulting in a wrenching loss of faith of the general public in the intentions of Britain. The ineffective inquiry and the initial accolades for Dyer by the House of Lords fueled widespread anger, leading to the non-cooperation movement of 1920–22. On Sunday 13 April 1919, Dyer was convinced of a major insurrection and he banned all meetings. However, this notice was not widely disseminated. That was the day of Baisakhi, the main Sikh festival, and many villages had gathered in the Bagh. On hearing that a meeting had assembled at Jallianwala Bagh, Dyer went with 50 Gurkha riflemen to a raised bank and ordered them to shoot at the crowd. Dyer continued the firing for about 10 minutes, until the ammunition supply was almost exhausted. Dyer stated that 1,650 rounds had been fired, a number which seems to have been derived by counting empty cartridge cases picked up by the troops. Official British Indian sources gave a figure of 379 identified dead, with approximately 1,100 wounded. The casualty number estimated by the Indian National Congress was more than 1,500, with approximately 1,000 dead. Dyer was initially lauded by conservative forces in the Empire, but in July 1920 he was censured and forced to retire by the House of Commons. He became a celebrated hero in Britain among most of the people connected to the British Raj, for example, the House of Lords, but unpopular in the House of Commons, which voted against Dyer twice. The massacre caused a re-evaluation of the Army's role, in which the new policy became minimum force, and the Army was retrained and developed suitable tactics for crowd control. Some historians consider the episode a decisive step towards the end of British rule in India, although others believe that greater self-government was inevitable as a result of India's involvement in World War I. Background: Defence of India Act. During World War I, British India contributed to the British war effort by providing men and resources. About 1.25 million Indian soldiers and labourers served in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, while both the Indian administration and the princes sent large supplies of food, money, and ammunition. However, Bengal and Punjab remained sources of anti-colonial activities. Revolutionary attacks in Bengal, associated increasingly with disturbances in Punjab, were significant enough to nearly paralyze the regional administration. Of these, a pan-Indian mutiny in the British Indian Army planned for February 1915 was the most prominent amongst a number of plots formulated between 1914 and 1917 by Indian nationalists in India, the United States and Germany. The planned February mutiny was ultimately thwarted when British intelligence infiltrated the Guard-Right movement, arresting key figures. Mutinies in smaller units and garrisons within India were also crushed. In the scenario of the British war effort and the threat from the militant movement in India, the Defence of India Act 1915 was passed, limiting civil and political liberties. Michael O'Dwyer, then the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, was one of the strongest proponents of the Act, in no small part due to the Guard-Right threat in the province. Rowlatt Act. The costs of the protracted war in money and manpower were great. High casualty rates in the war, increasing inflation after the end, compounded by heavy taxation, the deadly 1918 flu pandemic, and the disruption of trade during the war escalated human suffering in India. In 1916, the Congress succeeded in establishing the Lucknow Pact, a temporary alliance with the All India Muslim League. British political concessions and Whitehall's India policy after World War I began to change, with the passage of Montague-Chelmsford reforms which initiated the first round of political reform in the Indian subcontinent in 1917. However, this was deemed insufficient in reforms by the Indian political movement. Mahatma Gandhi, recently returned to India, began emerging as an increasingly charismatic leader under whose leadership civil disobedience movements grew rapidly as an expression of political unrest. The recently crushed Ghadar conspiracy, the presence of Mahendra Pratap's Kabul mission in Afghanistan, and a still active revolutionary movement especially in Punjab and Bengal led to the appointment of a sedition committee in 1918 chaired by Sidney Rowlatt, an English judge. It was tasked to evaluate German and Bolshevik links to the militant movement in India, especially in Punjab and Bengal. On the recommendations of the committee, the Rowlatt Act, an extension of the Defence of India Act 1915, was enforced in India, which limited civil liberties. The passage of the Rowlatt Act in 1919 precipitated large-scale political unrest throughout India. Ominously, in 1919, the Third Anglo-Afghan War began in the wake of Amir Habibullah's assassination, an institution of Amanullah in a system strongly influenced by the political figures courted by Kabul mission during the World War. In addition, in India, Gandhi's call for protest against the Rowlatt Act achieved an unprecedented response of furious unrest and protests. The situation, especially in Punjab, was deteriorating rapidly, with disruptions of rail, telegraph and communication systems. The movement was at its peak before the end of the first week of April, with some recording that practically the whole of Lahore was on the streets. The immense crowd that passed through Anarkali was estimated to be around 20,000. In Amritsar, over 5,000 people gathered at Jallianwala Bagh. This situation deteriorated perceptibly over the next few days. Michael O'Dwyer is said to have been of the firm belief that these were the early and ill-concealed signs of a conspiracy for a coordinated uprising around May, on the lines of the 1857 revolt, at a time when British troops would have withdrawn to the hills for the summer. The Amritsar Massacre, as well as responses preceding and succeeding it, was the end result of a concerted plan of response from the Punjab administration to suppress such a conspiracy. Prelude to the massacre. Many officers in the Indian Army believed revolt was possible, and they prepared for the worst. In Amritsar, more than 15,000 people gathered at Jallianwala Bagh. The British Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, is said to have believed that these were the early and ill-concealed signs of a conspiracy for a coordinated revolt around May, at a time when British troops would have withdrawn to the hills for the summer. The Amritsar Massacre, as well as responses preceding and succeeding it, have been described by some historians as the end result of a concerted plan of response from the Punjab administration to suppress such a conspiracy. James Hussain Boli is said to have ascribed a direct relationship between the fear of a Ghadarite uprising in the midst of an increasingly tense situation in Punjab, and the British response that ended in the massacre. On 10 April 1919, there was a protest at the residence of the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar, a city in Punjab, a large province in the northwestern part of India. The demonstration was to demand the release of two popular leaders of the Indian independence movement, Satya Pal and Saifuddin Kichlu, who had been earlier arrested by the government and moved to a secret location. Both were proponents of the Satyagraha movement led by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A military picket shot at the crowd, killing several protesters and setting off a series of violent events. Later the same day, several banks and other government buildings, including the town hall and the railway station, were attacked and set afire. The violence continued to escalate, culminating in the deaths of at least 5 Europeans, including government employees and civilians. There was retaliatory shooting at crowds from the military several times during the day, and between 8 and 20 people were killed. On the 11th of April, Miss Marcella Sherwood, an English missionary, fearing for the safety of her pupils, was on her way to shut the schools and send the roughly 600 Indian children home. While cycling through a narrow street called the Kutcha, she was caught by a mob, pulled to the ground by her hair, stripped naked, beaten, kicked, and left for dead. She was rescued by some local Indians, including the father of one of her pupils, who hid her from the mob and then smuggled her to the safety of Govindgarh Fort. After visiting Sherwood on the 19th of April, the Raj's local commander, Colonel Dyer, issued an order requiring every Indian man using that street to crawl its length on his hands and knees. Colonel Dyer later explained to a British inspector, "Some Indians crawl face downwards in front of their gods. I wanted them to know that a British woman is as sacred as a Hindu god and therefore they have to crawl in front of her." 2. He also authorized the indiscriminate, public whipping of locals who came within lathy length of British policemen. Miss Marcella Sherwood later defended Colonel Dyer, describing him as the savior of the Punjab. For the next 2 days, the city of Amritsar was quiet, but violence continued in other parts of the Punjab. Railway lines were cut, telegraph posts destroyed, government buildings burnt, and 3 Europeans murdered. By the 13th of April, the British government had decided to put most of the Punjab under martial law. The legislation restricted a number of civil liberties, including freedom of assembly. Gatherings of more than 4 people were banned. On the evening of the 12th of April, the leaders of the Hartal in Amritsar held a meeting at the Hindu college, Darbkartikhan. At the meeting, Hans Raj, an aide to Dr. Kitchlew, announced a public protest meeting would be held at 16:30 the following day in the Jallianwala Bagh, to be organized by a drive, Muhammad Bashir, and chaired by a senior and respected Congress party leader, Lal Kanhai Lal Bhatia. A series of resolutions protesting the Rowlatt Act, the recent actions of the British authorities and the detention of Drs. Satyapal and Kitchlew was drawn up and approved, after which the meeting adjourned. The massacre. At 900 on the morning of the 13th of April, the traditional festival of Baisakhi, Colonel Reginald Dyer, the acting military commander for Amritsar and its environs, proceeded through the city with several city officials, announcing the implementation of a pass system to enter or leave Amritsar, a curfew beginning at 2000 that night, and a ban on all processions and public meetings of 4 or more persons. The proclamation was read and explained in English, Urdu, Hindi and Punjabi, but few paid it any heed or appear to have learned of it later. Meanwhile, the local Sidh had received intelligence of the planned meeting in the Jallianwala Bagh through word of mouth and plainclothes detectives in the crowds. At 12:40, Dyer was informed of the meeting and returned to his base at around 13:30 to decide how to handle it. By mid-afternoon, thousands of Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh near the Harmandir Sahib in Amritsar. Many who were present had earlier worshipped at the Golden Temple, and were passing through the Bagh on their way home. The Bagh was a large, open area of 6 to 7 acres, roughly 200 yards by 200 yards in size, and surrounded by walls roughly 10 feet in height. Balconies of houses 3 to 4 stories tall overlooked the Bagh, and 5 narrow entrances opened onto it, several with locked gates. During the rainy season, it was planted with crops, but served as a local meeting area and playground for much of the year. In the center of the Bagh was a samadhi in a large well partly filled with water and about 20 feet in diameter. Apart from pilgrims, Amritsar had filled up over the preceding days with farmers, traders and merchants attending the annual Baisakhi horse and cattle fair. The city police closed the fair at 1400 that afternoon, resulting in a large number of people drifting into the Jallianwala Bagh. It was estimated that about 20,000 to 25,000 people had gathered in the Bagh by the time of the meeting. Dyer sent an aeroplane to overfly the Bagh and estimate the size of the crowd. By this time, both Colonel Dyer and Deputy Commissioner Irving, the senior civil authority for Amritsar, were well aware of the meeting, but took no actions to prevent it or send police to peacefully disperse the crowds. This would later be a serious criticism leveled at both Dyer and Irving. An hour after the meeting began as scheduled at 16:30. Colonel Dyer arrived at the Bagh with a group of 65 Gurkha and 25 Baluchi and Pathan soldiers. 50 of them were armed with 303 Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles, 40 with Kukris. It is not clear whether Dyer had specifically chosen troops from those ethnic groups due to their proven loyalty to the British or that they were simply the non-Sikh units most readily available. He had also brought 2 armored cars armed with machine guns. However, the vehicles were left outside, as they were unable to enter the Bagh through the narrow entrances. The Jallianwala Bagh was surrounded on all sides by houses and buildings and had few narrow entrances. Most of them were kept permanently locked. The main entrance was relatively wide, but was guarded heavily by the troops backed by the armored vehicles. Dyer, without warning the crowd to disperse, blocked the main exits. He explained later that this act was not to disperse the meeting but to punish the Indians for disobedience. Dyer ordered his troops to begin shooting toward the denser sections of the crowd. Firing continued for approximately 10 minutes. Ceasefire was ordered only when ammunition supplies were almost exhausted. After approximately 1,650 rounds were spent, many people died in stampedes at the narrow gates or by jumping into the solitary well on the compound to escape the shooting. A plaque, placed at the site after independence, states that 120 bodies were removed from the well. The wounded could not be moved from where they had fallen, as a curfew was declared, and many more died during the night. The number of deaths caused by the shooting is disputed. In July 1919, 3 months after the massacre, officials were tasked with finding who had been killed by inviting inhabitants of the city to volunteer information about those who had died. This information was incomplete due to fear that those who participated would be identified as having been present at the meeting, and some of the dead may not have had close relations in the area. When interviewed by the members of the committee, a senior civil servant in Punjab admitted that the actual figure could be higher, since the official figures were probably flawed regarding the size of the crowd, the number of rounds fired and the period of shooting. The Indian National Congress instituted a separate inquiry of its own, with conclusions that differed considerably from the government's inquiry. The casualty number quoted by the Congress was more than 1,500, with approximately 1,000 being killed. The government tried to suppress information of the massacre, but news spread in India and widespread outrage ensued. Details of the massacre did not become known in Britain until December 1919.